Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show here on Reason and Theology. Really excited about this discussion that we are going to have that's going to cover a wide range of topics, but especially a focus on the question: did Israel steal land from the Palestinians? Of course, with the war going on, there's a lot of discussions about this topic, and I hear this claim thrown out a lot. And so I thought it would be helpful to explore this with my two guests. Here I have Professor Villeneuve and also Ariel Birnbaum, who served in the IDF, and I'm going to have each one of them introduce themselves. So, yeah, Professor Villeneuve, if you want to go ahead and maybe just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about you and your background.
Sure, Michael. Thanks for having me back. My name is Dr. Andre Villeneuve. I'm originally from Canada. I am professor of sacred scripture and biblical languages at Sacred Heart Major Seminary in Detroit. I've been here for 3 years. In my previous life, I used to live in Israel, so I spent 12 years in Israel, from where I met Ariel a number of years ago. Had not seen him in quite a while. And so I did my PhD at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in religious studies, studying scripture and ancient Judaism. And so I'm also the founder and director of Catholics for Israel.
Mhm.
And all these questions regarding Israel today are very much dear to me. And I think that Israel deserves a better and fairer treatment in how we report about the issues, about all that's going on over there.
And you and I had a discussion previously where we discussed the church in Israel and all questions surrounding that. So I put a link to that in the show notes. Y'all go and watch it. It is a very in-depth exploration of topics surrounding, the new Israel, whether the church has replaced Israel, stuff like that. So we go into all of that there. Go and check that out. By the way, um, Professor, are you the author of the commentary for the Ignatius Study Bible on Tobit and Judith and I think a few other books?
You've looked me up. There's no
I,
hiding
I
from
came
my
across that
secret.
accidentally, and I thought it may have indicated you were the author, and so I wanted to get your comments on that because, first of all, I love the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible, and I understand it's going to be released pretty soon. But right now, they kind of have individual books. I did not know that you contributed to that. That's awesome.
Yeah, I think I may have done the content editing for that one.
Mhm.
So I did a number of volumes. I'm actually losing track. Yeah, I did the content editing. I wrote Sirach. I actually wrote the one on Sirach and have an upcoming one with the Catholic commentary on sacred scripture on Sirach.
That's epic. So perhaps I'll need to get you back on to discuss that in more detail, and especially talk about those books from a Catholic
Okay.
perspective. So we'll do that. Okay, yeah, Ariel, if you want to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. My name is Ariel, and I'm an Israeli. I grew up in Israel most of my life. Right now, I'm in the U.S., but I moved here about 5 years ago. And I grew up in Israel. I served in the IDF as a mandatory service, and I was a combat soldier for 3 years. Yeah, I had some experience also in Gaza related to what's happening right now. It was from 2005 to 2008. So I'm if I share experiences about that period of time, and it's relevant to that time frame. But I believe it's relevant to stuff that's happening today. I studied history in the Open University in Israel. So I have a degree in history, mostly biblical studies and the history of the Middle East. That's kind of my background, my passion as well. I also studied to be a tour guide to Israel. So that's my profession. That's what I've been doing for about 10 over 10 years. I moved here actually to work for a travel company to arrange tours to visit Israel. Explaining the land of Israel and connecting people to the Bible, to the different geographical places. That's kind of what my passion. And also for me growing up there, it basically gave me that perspective of this is a land that I know very well. I would walk around places, hike a lot. So the geography and the topography and specifically the history is very, very it's part of my passion. The whole story that's happening right now, and if you can call it a story, the epic of the war, it's very dramatic, and it's changing a lot of things that even relationships between Jews and Arabs, and the whole narratives are shifting, and people are changing different perspectives, and it's kind of very challenging to navigate it these days. Me personally, also an Israeli, but also someone that I have several connections, I would say, with Palestinians and Palestinian Christians, and with people that I really believed in reconciliation and trying to build bridges, and that's something that I actually did prior to my service. Was a kind of as a teenager, and also a little bit after my service. So these days it's kind of a little challenging, kind of to bridge through that, trying to understand the whole map of how to do that in a right way, and also related to relying on facts and relying on stuff that are really really important and solid. So that's kind of my background in a nutshell. Obviously, there's a lot more, but I wanted to focus on the topics themselves. It's not about myself here, but
Sure.
I'm really honored to be here. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's still good that you're able to speak from your experience, but also you can
Yeah.
speak kind of from a historical perspective since you have a background in that. That's good. And by the way, next time I go to Israel, I'll have to kind of call on you for some traveling tips.
Okay.
So
Sure. Yeah. Great.
anyway, yeah, so let's dive in here, and I don't know, Professor, if you want to maybe start out, but feel free to jump in if you want to tackle this one. My main question here is going to be, did Israel steal land from the Palestinians? It's kind of like one of the number one questions, because so many of the claims that I'm noticing out there on social media really kind of hinge on this. So if you want to tackle that, and of course, Ariel, if you want to jump in as well, feel free. Kind of open format.
Sure. Well, some would say it's a complicated question. Others would say it's actually quite a simple question. So if Israel stole land for the Palestinians, are we talking kind of at a micro level, certain individual incidents, and we can go in that direction? Probably it'd be better to start on the macro level, just looking at the history of the land. And so just looking at the various political rule over Israel, from whom did Israel get the land? So if we backtrack back to 1967, we have the West Bank that was occupied by Jordan, and Gaza that was occupied by Egypt. So there was a prior occupation. So you might say, okay, Israel took land from Jordan and Egypt following a war that they started, and from Syria with the Golan Heights. So, okay, but what about before that? Go back to 1948, and then we have the British Mandate. And so there was no Palestinian state there. And who were before the British ruling over the Holy Land, over Palestine? Then we go back to the Ottomans in 1917. So still no Palestinians there. And the Ottomans ruled for 400 years, from 1517 to 1917. So who were before the Ottomans? Then we go back to other Muslims, the Mamluks, this dynasty from Egypt. And before the Mamluks, we have the Crusaders. And before the Crusaders, we had the early Arab caliphates, going back to the rise of Islam. And before that, we go back to the Byzantine Empire, and then before that to the Roman Empire. And before that, who do we stumble upon? Palestinians? No, actually the Kingdom of Israel, either during the time of the Maccabees, or before that, we go back to the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, the Persian Empire, and then again back to the Kingdom of Israel. So we never actually encounter an actual Palestinian state. So that is really at the heart of the controversy, not to negate the difficulties that obviously Palestinians exist today. We can't deny that, the very fact of their existence. But something happened in that really rewrote history. We know the Palestinian nationalistic movement really emerged out of the 1960s. And before that, the West Bank and Gaza were Jordanian and Egyptian. So we can talk about the details, but that is really the big story before we start throwing accusations at Israel of stealing land. Well, why was no one complaining about Jordanian or Egyptian occupation before 1967, or the British occupation before 1948? So I think that's really like a starting point. We need to be aware of the history of the land and the fact that there never was a Palestinian state. It was always under some kind of foreign domination, and usually some kind of a massive empire, as I just mentioned.
So when we speak of Palestinians, what are we referring to if there was never a Palestinian state?
Yeah, I mean, the Palestinians, what is interesting when you look at the Palestine in the 1930s, it was the British mandate of Palestine, and those who call themselves Palestinians were actually the Jews. You can see the literature and the stamps, for example, and the Jerusalem Post used to be called the Palestine Post. So who are the Palestinians? They were the Jews. And so it was a surprise to a lot of people in the 1960s when I mean, Yasser Arafat played a big part in that, but it was not only him, that there was a type of a rising of this Palestinian nationalistic movement where there's a type of hijacking of the term Palestinian, because before that, they called themselves Arabs, and they were, as we said, either Jordanians or Egyptians, and there was no such thing as an actual Palestinian people. So once again, it's not to negate the suffering and the difficulties of the Arab Palestinians today, but once again, any kind of discussion has to be based on truth and not on a rewriting of history.
What were the Arabs in that territory prior to 1948 called?
I think Arabs. Ariel, what do you think?
Yeah. So some of them would affiliate with the southern Syria. I think it was Sham, which is kind of, the center of the Arab world was focused on Damascus and in that area. The affiliation was, broader, like more Arab in the broader term, not necessarily a local national identity. So it's very hard to kind of identify when people actually decide, to claim that they're a nation. Many historians and many research people that do research on this believe that that nationhood actually was established in contrast to Zionism. To kind of say, okay, now that the Jews are claiming this land, we're gonna develop our own national identity. So kind of provoke that. I would kind of add to what Andre said. It is the connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel is a thread that doesn't you can't ignore that. Now, the fact that there was always a remnant of Jews in the land of Israel in some sort of and another. Jews settled in mostly in holy cities in different areas. Eventually, also developed the land prior to even the Zionist movement. This, that was officially established by Herzl in 1897. With the Basel plan, but that the Jews would always have that connection to the land. Now, in some instances, if you're talking about stealing land, Jews actually own land. Like, for instance, in the city of Jaffa, Jews established the neighbors in some areas of Jaffa. Already in the 1860s, outside of the walls of Jerusalem, there was a lot of Jews that either purchased land and developed the land. It's not the land itself was never taken by force by Palestinians until the war in 1948, basically, until the war that basically decided the fate of the whole region. So that's something that I think many people miss. They think that Jews just decided to come as a colonial idea, which is kind of absurd, because the whole Zionist movement would be like an anti-colonial attempt to that Jews could settle, and most Jews were refugees. And most Jews had to find a place. They were running away from pogroms, running away from, the Holocaust. Jews in the Arab world and Muslim world were running away from atrocities that happened to, Jews that were running away from persecution. It's just kind of it's very important to kind of remember that claim before you kind of say, where did the Jews always, how did they show up? Where did they come from? They didn't come from, nowhere. And, also in the Jewish tradition, obviously, that strong connection to the land is enshrined in the Jewish tradition. 3 times a day, people pray towards Jerusalem. Returning the yield for the returning of the captives back to Zion There's all kinds of different things that the Jews pray on a regular basis. It's yeah.
Well, how was the nation of Israel established in 1948? Like practically, what happened? Because we often hear that, there were Palestinians that were displaced in order to establish this nation, and that Israel just kind of came in and stole land. Let's talk about that a little bit more specifically.
Sure. So the British, they had the mandate over Palestine at the time, and eventually there was a few commissions that were trying to divide the land. There was the Peel Commission, I think it was 1937, if I remember correctly, and then which was adopted by the Zionist movement. I think it was rejected by most of the Arab leaders, if I'm correct. And then in 1947, on the 29th of November, that's when the UN resolution decided on the partition plan. So the British had a time frame, and it was actually the 15th of May, if we're talking about, I think it's today, that they would leave. So David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Zionist organization or Zionist movement, decided to declare the independence the day the British left, to basically take initiative, because the British basically decided that they're not going to control the area since then. And that's based practically how that happens. The Declaration of Independence was right after that. That's when officially, according to the Israel, the war started, which we call the War of Independence, and the Arab nations started to squeeze in. There's a lot of declarations of different leaders that decided that they want to annihilate the Jews out of the land, and it was an attempt to wipe the Zionist entity out of existence. But Israel survived, and it won the war. But the ceasefire lines were defined in 1949 after the war. We have the West Bank that was controlled by Jordan, and you had Gaza Strip that was controlled by Egypt, and the remaining area is what is now known as proper Israel. But that's 1949, which many mistakenly call the lines of the borders of 1967, which is related to the Six-Day War, which is a different era. But basically, it was a fight for existence for the people of Israel in 1948.
Yeah, Andre, did you want to follow up with anything there?
Yeah, what's really tragic about this conflict is that, first, in terms of physical space, there is enough room for both peoples in the land of Israel. And what's really tragic is that the Palestinians were offered a land several times.
Right.
As Ariel said, in 1938, there was a now largely forgotten Peel plan, a partition plan then. And remember, this was the British mandate after World War I. So the Brits were there controlling the land, and there were both Jews and Arabs there. And I think there was always a willingness on the Jewish side, to accept a two-state solution. But then, as Ariel said, in 1948, partition plan, the Jews accepted, the Arabs rejected. They launched this first war, which indeed was a genocidal war against the very survival of the state of Israel. So now today we have a huge Palestinian refugee problem, but it's kind of absurd. How many nations you still have refugees after some 70 years using these refugees as political pawns, essentially? What is often forgotten is that there were also 700,000 to 800,000 Jewish refugees who were kicked out of Arab Islamic countries in 1948, and they were immediately integrated into the state of Israel. So there's a complete disproportionality in how Jewish refugees were integrated into Israel, but Palestinian Arab or Palestinian refugees are still held as kind of political playing cards today, and many of whom are in Gaza or in the West Bank. So 1948 was just one of many instances. We had the Oslo Accords, we had offers to the Palestinians in the early 2000s, offering them a state, and it was always rejected on the Palestinian side. And I've had so many conversations, even with Palestinians. It's well known in Palestinian media that some, to be fair, some would be willing to accept a two-state solution, but it's really a small minority. Even after October 7th, we've seen polls to the like of, I think, 75 to 85% of Palestinians who still support Hamas. So that makes it really difficult for, if you're Israel, what are you going to do? Sure, let's make a deal with these enemies sworn to our annihilation. And where can we meet in the middle? You want to kill us, so can we compromise somewhere? And that makes it really, really difficult. And so that's why Israel is found in the bind that it's in today with the situation in Gaza.
I want to talk a little bit more about that, the Palestinian perspective of Israelis. But first, one more question. I think you had spoken of, the acquisition of land on a macro level versus a micro level. Can you maybe talk about on the micro level? Were there instances where some Arabs in the land had their land stolen from them?
Yeah, I mean, maybe Ariel, you know more of the details. I'm not extremely familiar on the specifics. I don't doubt that some of that occurred. I know, for example, when Israel built the security barrier and the wall following the Second Intifada, that there probably was some encroachment there. And so I'm not denying, I consider myself a Zionist, and to be a Zionist, it doesn't mean that you can never say that you have to give a blank check to everything that Israel does. And so we're talking about a situation of conflict. In the early 2000s, you had murderous intifada with Israelis being killed every day, basically, in suicide attacks. So if you're in a situation of war, you're going to see things happening that are not pretty, just as we're seeing in Gaza. It's truly a tragedy. And so it's okay to kind of to have your heart break to see the human suffering that comes out of there. So again, I can't speak to specifics, and I'm sure some of that happens, but I think by and large, you're seeing Israel has acted in a way that is reasonably fair, considering the existential threat that they have faced and the culture of incitement and hatred that permeates Palestinian media and culture and governmental agencies, and that we see everywhere. I wonder which other state would react in a way that is as restrained as Israel does. If you're living together or side by side or in the midst of a whole population that is essentially vowed to your annihilation. So it's not an easy situation to be in.
I've actually heard people say, "Oh, the first and second intifadas were mostly peaceful." What would you say in response to people who make that claim?
It's the first I hear that suicide bombings are mostly peaceful.
Right. Yeah. So when you try to explain the first Intifada, Israel did occupy the cities of the West Bank and Gaza as well, or I think most of the area around the city of Gaza. So, you could explain the whole uprising as, something that bubbled up. But eventually, the whole, so the targeting of military is something, that you could explain. But when you target civilians, that's something that no one that's rational can explain that. I grew up in the 1990s in Israel, and growing up being afraid of going on buses. Just hearing Arabic on the street was kind of alarming sometimes. You just were always kind of fearful about, your existence, because we know one of the bus lines that my mom would take to work every day, that bus line blew up. There's a guy that went on the bus. He had a belt and he blew himself up, and all in the cause of trying to fight the Oslo Accords, or trying to manipulate the whole conversation to support the Palestinians, or actually to maybe do something, do harm towards the Israelis. Intifada is a jihad, and a jihad is a war that is very brutal, and it's against civilians. And the fact that people in the West and different things are chanting that today is kind of absurd, because they don't understand the whole meaning behind it. Speaking about Israel, we can't say that Israel doesn't have any flaws. That's 100% correct, like every country. However, there's different reasons for things that happen, and there's the agenda, I would say, and the whole maybe the perspective is a bit you always have to see why things happen and what kind of provoked stuff to happen. But again, it's not to say that the Palestinians, they have a lot to deal with on how they the propaganda against Jews, the ruthless ideology that, now I would say all the Palestinians, we can't, I don't want to generalize, but to understand that that's a very important part of their culture. In Israel, when I grew up, that's for instance in the Israeli school system, talking about peace and talking about engaging with the Arabs was a very important part of the narrative, the historical narrative that we talked about Israel. We're very proud about the peace agreement that we have with Egypt. We're very, very proud about the peace agreement that we have with Jordan, the openness to the world. The fact that many Jews have they come from Arab countries, right? Muslim or Arab countries. So the Arab culture is something that Israelis really like and really adore, and even the cross culture, foods and different things. So they really want to engage in the whole Middle East as part of the culture. It's not something foreign for them. But understanding the other side, when you try to see in the school systems on the Palestinian side, it's very rare that even talk about engaging with the Jews or trying to have any type of normal relationship, which is very unfortunate, because a lot of Jews, a lot of Israelis, they really want to have that, and unfortunately, just to it's worth to mention this, that the atrocity, the massacre of October 7th, and the massacre of October 7th, many of the civilians that were attacked were people that really believed in peace, and they really had personal relationships with people in Gaza, and they helped out with humanitarian aid. They helped out with bringing people from the checkpoints to hospitals, making sure that they get treatment, and they really believed in that. And they were some of the the first to be slaughtered. They didn't really ask. They didn't care. They didn't. And that's kind of an unfortunate situation, obviously. I think anyone who has any small sentiment towards that type of act, supporting it or saying, but the the Israelis have 76 years of occupation or something like that. It's very hard to hear that, and very hard to actually have a dialogue with someone that actually can sympathize with such brutal acts.
What years did you say you lived there?
Myself?
Mm-hmm.
So from 1991 until 2019.
Yeah, I was there
Yeah.
91 to I think 96 the second time.
Okay.
I remember you had mentioned there and suicide bombing. I remember my sister went with my mom's boyfriend at the time to a bank, and right after they left, it blew up from a terrorist attack. So that kind of stuff unfortunately happens a lot, and was certainly going on then. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the Palestinian perspective of Israelis. Obviously, we have to paint with a broad brush here. Not everybody believes the exact same thing, but maybe let's talk about this from what you've seen. And Ariel, if you could maybe comment on this from your own experience while you were there in Gaza, what exactly did they think of Israelis, according to your experience?
So I served in a combat unit, and most of my service was around Gaza, and we also did some operations in Gaza itself. I didn't have there weren't too many interactions directly with civilians in Gaza, because Gaza basically was starting from 2005. Israel withdrew its forces from the territory of Gaza, so there's no checkpoints or different or control over the civilians in Gaza. But in the West Bank, I would say the interactions with Israelis is through the checkpoints, is through the soldiers, and that's a very harsh reality for the Palestinians, that they only know the Israelis are are the soldiers, are the the occupation people, that they control their lives and they control basically movement between different areas. But on the other hand, you could see that in very several instances and different places around different cities and different areas, that the soldiers are onto themselves. They're not they're not there to raid and to go and mock and do all kinds of stuff. There are different operations when they go into cities and do that, but there's the main mission of the IDF is to defend the state of Israel, which means that is that's the first thing in line, not to annihilate, not to kick out Palestinians, not to hate them. That is something that there's also a code of ethics that every soldier has that has to kind of go according to that. I experienced it when I was in Gaza, and there was a few battles and different things that we participated in. The soldiers that would would loot stuff, take stuff from the battlefield, they were severely punished. That was something that was a very important thing, that we would never do that. And it's true that people did do that, but they were severely punished. The other thing is, when you engage with civilians, you have to make sure that their dignity, you put them. In my personal situation, I was in a house in Gaza, and there was a family there, so we made sure that the family was placed in the side. We did take over their house for a few days. It was a mission to try to arrest terrorists in a refugee camp. But eventually, we made sure that these people were treated fairly, that they got food, that made sure that they were protected. So the mission of the soldier is not to extinct or to kill. I mean, the whole notion of genocide and all the different things, that is not on the agenda of the IDF as a whole, and of the soldiers themselves. It's not something that they even think about. Yes, they're terrified to death, and different situations where you're protecting your lives, and you are a soldier and you are trained to kill and eventually. But the purpose is not to not to do that. Our mind, back in the back of our minds, is to protect our families back home. Where I was stationed was like 2 hours away from where my parents lived, where I lived. So we have that feeling that you're protecting your country, doing the best, also to avoid hurting civilians, innocent civilians. But understanding the mission, understanding the idea that you're here, you're doing it out of love to your country and to your people, and not out of hate towards the other side. That's kind of what I felt as far as most of the soldiers that I interact with, most of the situations that we interact with. That's not the idea that we're going there to to hate the Palestinians.
Think of Norman Finkelstein, who speaks of Gaza as an open-air concentration camp. Based on your experience there, would you say that's an accurate description?
No, I don't think so. It's a very, very, harsh statement. Obviously, it has, obviously there's a lot of notion behind it. Israel does and did control the borders and the boundaries around Gaza. And there were a lot of, restrictions for Gazans to come closer to the border. They do control the sea, and the certain an area where people can go fishing and doing all kinds of stuff. And also Egypt also controls their border. So it's like it's an area that is yet heavily monitored. That's correct. But saying that's a concentration camp, that's putting it in a different level, because there was a self-governing entity there. Okay, originally when Israel withdrew from Gaza, it was the Palestinian Authority. Eventually, Hamas won the elections. They took over and they kicked out all the Palestinian Authority people, the PLO. By saying kicked out, by the way, they slaughtered them, they threw them off roofs, did all kinds of stuff like that. But they took over and they controlled Gaza. And I've seen pictures of Gaza and videos of places where they have hotels, they have all kinds of their life was relatively, they had everything they needed. There was a lot of food, so it's not like they weren't starved to death. Obviously, it's not that they were open to the world, and their only gate into the world was either through the checkpoints in Israel. A lot of people worked in Israel, and in farms and stuff like that, or their entrance to the world was through Gaza. So they were allowed to leave. Obviously, there's a lot of processes of how to do that, and there's different things, but it's definitely not by definition a concentration camp. That's a very harsh statement to say.
And Professor, let me get you to weigh in on the same question, and also maybe tackle the question of, are Palestinians free to just kind of come and go, or are they just confined to a particular territory? If you can also address that as well.
Sure. Well, of course, now there are lots of restrictions. We're in a situation of conflict, a situation of war. Again, as I said earlier, I think it's really important to not lose sight of the larger context. As Ariel just said, for sure, access to Gaza is very restricted, and we probably have no idea of the destruction now after half a year war, and no doubt it's very bad. But the broader historical perspective cannot be forgotten. And one thing that always frustrated me from my time in Israel is how Palestinians seem to always refuse to take responsibility for their actions. And so first thing we need to remember, October 7th was not an isolated incident. As Ariel said, in 2005, Israel withdrew from Gaza unilaterally, saying, let's give them the whole area. They can rule over themselves. Maybe they receive a lot of money from the EU and from the US and the UN. So, maybe they can build their economy, and maybe we can finally be neighbors if we just give them the land. And immediately they vote in Hamas. We have this bloody civil war, and Hamas takes over. And immediately they start building these terror tunnels, this extensive network of tunnels for the sake of attacking Israelis. They have these constant waves of rocket attacks against Israeli population centers. So once again, if you're Israel, what are you going to do? If you're the Israeli government, are you going to say, sure, let's just let them come and go? And they still gave work permits to Gazans to come into Israel. And many of them informed Hamas about these Israeli communities, which they attacked on October 7th. So October 7th was not an isolated incident. We have already nearly 20 years of constant attacks from Gaza. So is the situation in Gaza bad? No doubt it is very bad. But once again, if you're suffering from a bad situation, are you going to take responsibility for what led this situation? We have plenty of videos of Palestinians celebrating these so-called innocent Palestinian civilians who are celebrating, and as these Hamas activists are coming back to Gaza with bodies or hostages, and they're spitting and beating these, in many cases, already dead Israelis and celebrating, Israelis are not going to forget these images for a long time, if ever. So once again, is the situation in Gaza bad? Of course it is. It's terrible. It's heartbreaking, especially for the Christians there who want no part in all of this, this chaos. But especially for our activists, aka useful idiots in the West, who are so gung-ho about taking the side of Gaza, if not to say Hamas, and calling out for an intifada. We're not really sure if they know what an intifada is. That's another story. We should never forget the broader perspective of the history. What led the conflict? What led us to this situation where we're at now? Decades of rocket attacks, of incitement, of basically genocidal rhetoric on the side of the Palestinians. So once again, I would ask anyone who is skeptical, whether Catholic listeners or anyone who's on the fence, if this were happening to your own country, what would you do if you had this extensive terror network on your borders, if you had rockets shot at your cities, if you had these insane barbarians who would come in and rape your women and slaughter entire families? What would you do? Just say, let's just live in peace, and sure, you can come and go as you wish and take all the money you want to buy weapons from Iran. What would you do would be my question to all those in the West who are on the fence in terms of where to stand in this conflict.
You mentioned Hamas there. Tell us a little bit more about Hamas. What exactly is their goal?
Ariel, go ahead.
So Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood movement. So it's actually the best manifestation of the Muslim Brotherhood ideology, which was, eventually started in Egypt. Hassan al-Banna is one of the leaders that started that ideology. And it's basically, they want to imply Sharia law over the entire land. And in their particles, in the protocols, they have a whole chapter about about the Jews and about what they're supposed to do with the Jews. I haven't read it, but I know from different things that people write that it's very purely anti-Semitic in that approach. That they really want to annihilate the Jews and put them on the side. They were civil. They have a civil branch and they have a military branch. So they do want to show civility. One of the things that they would do, they would build hospitals, they would build charities, make sure that the people believe in them, right? So they're that's one of the things that they did, and they became very popular amongst the Palestinians because of those acts and because of the the ideals that they represent and the kind of extremist Islamic approach to the end to the going back to the days of Muhammad and different things. So it's an ideological movement, and that's very hard to actually understand. How you can't really it's hard to fight an ideological movement. Hard to fight an ideology when it's very rooted in the fact that they don't want the existence of Jews in the land of Israel at all. And one thing that I would say, look, the idea of Palestine and Israel, basically, there's a competition over the land, in a way, quote unquote competition, but all of Palestine is Israel and all of Israel is Palestine. So they view the fact that Jews shouldn't ever exist in this land or shouldn't have an entity. They should be, submit under the wave of Islam, or be extinct. But it's a movement that developed, as a very grassroots movement, and now grew up. It got its power, also through the elections. That's true. They were elected, but they also took force. Anyone who is suspected of betraying them or collaborating with Israel is beheaded. They have and they control it with terror. So for the civilians that live in Gaza, that's a very, very harsh reality as well. Speaking of control, that was what they were under. They were under the control of Hamas. But it started, I think, after the first Intifada. I don't remember the exact year, but that's when it kind of started to kind of grow. And now it's probably the most popular movement in the Palestinian, amongst Palestinians, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah, now I want to talk a little bit about Hamas and its relationship to the Palestinians in Gaza. We often hear the claim that they use their own as human shields. What would you point to as the evidence that they intend to do that? Any specific examples that you could point to, either one of you?
I mean, there are plenty of videos and even of Palestinians. I think from the latest polls, as I mentioned earlier, there's still widespread support for Hamas, but there's also great hatred of Hamas among the simple Palestinian people who understand, who have enough clear sight enough to understand that they have brought this destruction upon the people. So all the leaders of Hamas, they're not even in Gaza. They're in Qatar, and they're multimillionaires and billionaires who are basically have embezzled all the funds that were passed on from the EU and other organizations to Gaza and to the Palestinians. So those who are aware enough, and you have some Palestinians who are almost at the risk of their lives, who speak out against these things. But there's no doubt about it that Hamas their ideology is more destructive than constructive. Because if it were constructive, they could have built Gaza and turned it into the Singapore of the Middle East, as it's often said. And they had plenty of opportunities to do that. So Unfortunately, the elephant in the room is the ideology of Islam, which is driven by the Islamic sacred texts, both the Quran and the Hadith, that are unwilling to accept for the existence of a Jewish state in the Middle East. And that makes it really, really difficult to be optimistic in terms of a political situation in the short or medium term, or even maybe long term, because there's this ideology that will not stop until there's no more Israel. And so that makes it kind of difficult to be optimistic.
Now,
One
go ahead.
situation, if you don't mind, I was listening to one of the hostages that was released from Gaza, and she said that, first of all, she was moved from place to place, from house to house, and one time she was brought to a school, and she said that there was a woman that kind of took care of her, and they have a blanket, and she was hiding in a school, and then all of a sudden she hears this loud noise launching out, and then she realized that she physically heard and saw that they were launching rockets from the school itself, towards Israel. So she kind of witnessed that, and she shared that in one of the interviews. So that's something that, schools, hospitals, different things. It's unfortunate. And then you see images of, Israel taking over the Shifa hospital, where that basically underneath it, there was a whole network of tunnels that was one of the headquarters, or one of the command places for Hamas for a while. So they do that intentionally because they know the hospitals are supposed to be protected. And that's evidence that, has been documented, and you can see it. It's posted online. Obviously, the IDF spokesman talked about it a lot and showed a lot of footage. So you could say, you're picking and choosing, but that's hard evidence that you can see from the unfortunate situation. We're launching rockets from heavily civilian areas. That's unfortunate for the people that live in Gaza, where they don't really have a place to hide, or they are happy that they're actually launching and attacking the Jews.
Sounds like you're muted, Michael.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, I've heard and also seen a lot of evidence that, many Palestinians are indoctrinated with material to absolutely despise Israelis. Now, again, that's not the position of every Palestinian, but
Yeah.
there certainly is an effort and intention to indoctrinate Palestinians with that kind of perspective. Have you observed that as well?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I would really urge your listeners and anyone who's listening to be careful with what is your source of information, because there is so much disinformation out there going out. And even just in the recent days and weeks, we've heard of a massive reassessment of the casualties in Gaza. Because what's the main source for all these casualties? Of course, everybody's concerned about the civilian casualties. But where do we get those numbers? Of course, they're Hamas numbers. They're the ones who are ruling Gaza, and they're the ones releasing the numbers of the dead. And we often hear of these so-called Pollywood where they actually stage, injuries of children and deaths, and it turns out that the corpses under blankets then start moving. So I'm not saying all is staged, and of course there are a lot of casualties, but we have to be really careful with the sources of information and what we believe in terms of the reports coming from the ground over there.
Now, we saw not long ago that the ICC said that it's plausible that Israel is engaging in genocide. And now we hear plenty of people just stating that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza as a matter of fact. I want y'all to weigh in on this question. What do you think about that? Is there any evidence that Israel is engaging in a genocide?
If they're committing a genocide, they're really doing a really bad job at it, because I don't know why they would open humanitarian corridors and drop leaflets to tell civilians to move to certain areas of Gaza to avoid being harmed. And also, you would wonder, how did the population in Gaza skyrocket in recent decades? I mean, that's really astonishing incompetence if they're really trying to accomplish to pull off a genocide there, and population has increased. Again, not to minimize the casualties that are undeniably there, but I don't know if the IDF would be making phone calls or sending text messages to evacuate civilians from combat zones if they were trying to commit a genocide.
The claim that Israel is doing genocide is a very ancient claim. It's not from this war. People have been claiming that since the 2000s, even before that. There are hard and there are harsh things that are happening in Gaza. It's a war, and yes, the footage is not, that there's a lot of destruction. But like Andre said, the context is very important, and the historical context is very important. Also, to understand that there's right now, obviously the state of Israel had a few clear missions of why the war was launched and what it wanted to achieve. We don't know if they'll achieve everything that they want to do, but the fact that there are Israeli civilians that have been kidnapped out of their beds that are still hiding in tunnels, that's a harsh reality. People are suffering in Israel, and if a lot of people like to call it a David and Goliath situation, but it's a lot. It's far more complex than that. Yes, Israel is very strong, and military. Israel has a strong military, but if they wanted to, they could. They could have annihilated the entire population of Gaza and kicked them out. They didn't do that, and also when you picture genocide, you have to picture the situation where you have soldiers that see civilians, they launch them on a wall and they shoot at them just for no reason. That's something that never happens by Israeli soldiers. That's something that never happens indirectly, where people just shoot people just because they want to or just because they hate them. Most of the engagements, by the way, of different the different battles that happen were in reaction to people that were launching at them. There was protection. There was basically battles that started. For instance, the last ceasefire that happened, the first to break this ceasefire with Hamas. There's a very I don't know what the strategy of Israel is. It's very hard to kind of define what exactly Israel wants to achieve at this moment, but it's definitely not to annihilate the entire population of Gaza. Maybe, and not even. Some people say they wanted to resettle in Gaza. That's something that probably is not something that's plausible at the moment, and I don't think that will happen. But it's definitely the main mission, again, is to protect the nation of Israel, to make sure that things like what happened on October 7th will never happen again, and eventually, if they can, annihilate the existence of Hamas as a leadership and as a tone of voice amongst the Palestinians in Gaza. And that's kind of the main mission of Israel, I think, at the moment.
What I've heard in response to all this, and I want to get your reaction to it, is, well, people say, well, of course, Israel can't just be outright genocidal and just, you go full on. And so they have to be a little bit more subtle. But the intention of genocide is there because Netanyahu and others have spoken about remember Amalek, and then they point to the tones there, the implications there. And so, well, what would you say in response to this stuff like that?
Yeah, it's obviously there's different opinions in Israel and different political parties and people that have different ways of expressing themselves. I would say this: the majority of Israelis condemn people that say words out like annihilating them, or there's one, I think, a Knesset member that said was thinking of launching an atomic bomb on Gaza.
Yeah.
Those are unfortunate things that people say. Is this something that can be that could be actually physically done by the state of Israel at the political constellation of today? No. And it is political rhetoric sometimes. Some people want to speak it out loud. Do people believe that? I'm sure there's minority of people that actually believe stuff like that, and that's true. It's a very, very small minority in Israel, I would say. Yes, after October 7th, you would say that most Israelis did turn a little bit or more or less to the right, as far as, trying to engage in being, and trying to negotiate, or even most Israelis probably would not believe in a two-state solution at the moment. But the main, there's in a war, in the time of war, it's very hard to actually try to have empathy towards the other side, right? And that's something that eventually will have to happen. The fact is that there are people that are trying to help Palestinians, and people that are still, supporting the humanitarian aid. But by the policy of the state of Israel, the humanitarian aid is done because that the state of Israel wants it to happen. And there's things that are, different initiatives, maybe not that are like we said, there's the corridor and all the different things that they're doing. So
well, and I know, Ariel, you only have an hour, but so if you need to go, that's fine. But feel free to stick around as long as you want. But if you need to,
I actually do need to go. Yeah, I'm.
No problem. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, and I hope your guest will have some more information about this. It's a very complex situation, and it's very unfortunate. And we all hope that this war will end, and that things will calm down, and that will happen. Just sometimes it's something that you have to consider. I would say always stick to the facts. Try to be open up to different opinions and different perspectives, because if you don't, you get wiped into all kinds of different movements and ideologies and emotions and stuff like that, specifically in the West. And like we said, showing empathy towards suffering is a very important part of what we need to do. We also have to stick to facts. So, there's you have to get a big balance there. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. We'll be in touch. I'm going to follow up here a little bit more with some questions with Professor. So yeah, can you maybe comment on that? Maybe talk to us a little bit about your response to people who say, well, there seems to be an intention to commit acts of genocide when you have important figures referring to remember Amalek and stuff like that. What would you say?
Yeah, I think like Ariel just said, there's a wide range of opinions in Israel. And do you want to find some extremist voices? You're going to find some. And especially since October 7th, I think we cannot... It's really difficult for us in the West to get a sense of the trauma that came out of this unprecedented massacre. And as I said earlier, whole families burned alive, kids shot in their beds, and babies murdered, and pregnant women. And it's a horrible and it's a heartbreaking thing, but it would be hard not to imagine the anger that has emerged out of Israel since then. And for sure, you're going to have many who have a certain sense of vengeance. They say they have planned this meticulously. They have had wide support on the part of the population. So is it a genocide? In any case, no. I mean, it's even nonsensical to make that claim. Is it a war where there are a lot of casualties on the other side? For sure. And is there a certain desire for revenge? No doubt. I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying we have to be aware of that after this unprecedented massacre, which once again was not one event in isolation. This is the culmination of decades of existential survival. So I think we really need to pray for both people in the Holy Land, for Israelis and Palestinians. But like Ariel said, anything we do must be based on facts. No amount of suffering can justify a rewriting of history or a distortion of things that actually happened.
Well, some are going to say that, October 7th is a response to acts on Israel's part that were equally as horrid. What would you say in response to those?
I would say if you justify October 7th on the basis of no matter what, you need to do a serious examination of conscience. If you're a Catholic, you need to go to confession. to use our language, I would say there's a serious problem in your moral compass to justify anything, this massacre of civilians. If there is a conflict, okay, fine. But once again, we have seen Israel allowing Gazans to come into Israel to work. There's been this, of course, there's a conflict. So there's been this tension between both peoples, but to justify this unprecedented attack, the slaughter of hundreds of youth in, just dancing at this festival and trying to have a good time. I mean, if you think that October 7th can be justified in any way, then you are the problem. That's what I would say.
There's also people who are your October 7th deniers who try to say, well, all the stuff we were told that happened on October 7th, a lot of it was exaggerated or was media propaganda. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, they're probably together up there with the Holocaust deniers because it's so well documented. We have video footage from the terrorists themselves. We have video footage from the police, from locals, and either you're living in delusion or you're completely malicious to be able to deny something that is so well documented. We have video footage of terrorists calling back home and boasting about the Jews that they have killed, to their own parents. And so I don't even think that's an objection that is even serious. That should really be engaged.
Yeah, I've heard some of those conversations. I want to show you a brief clip here from a video on Piers Morgan Uncensored, where you have a medical doctor in Gaza who says, well, we hear that Israel is warning civilians to leave Rafah, but in reality, it's insufficient warnings and they're just going in there before people have time to evacuate and stuff like that. I want to get your reaction to this. Play just a minute or two of it for just a second here.
Israel says we've evacuated Eastern Rafah. The first thing that comes to mind, you give them warnings and you send them, air-conditioned buses. They board the buses and they go into these evacuation areas in Al-Mawasi. And by the time you get there, you have these beautiful tents lined up with sanitary facilities waiting for you. That's not true. I mean, what we had to run from our safe house that's no longer safe, literally under the bombardment of the Israeli army. We just gathered our stuff and ran out of this house, which is a typical Palestinian experience. We did it twice. Our presence and our stay here in Gaza, the Palestinians have done it more than 7 or 8 times in the past 7 months. And when they get to Al-Mawasi, it's a desert. It's really a sandy land, empty land, where people carry their belongings on the back of a car or a truck or a donkey. They just dump it there and they start figuring out what's next. First, no water. You don't have tents because the supplies are not allowed in. And so they have to figure out how to create a shelter. And the problem is, if to buy a...
All right, so you kind of get the gist of it. Your reaction to them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not there. The guy has a better idea of what he's going through than I do in terms of the specifics. And as I said before, I have no doubt that the situation is truly terrible and for civilians. And is there any grounds for critiquing operations or the methodology of the Israeli army? I'm sure there are. I'm really more of a theologian who dabbles in a little bit of political philosophy than someone who's an expert on what's going on the ground in Israel. And as I say very often, even though I consider myself a Zionist, you don't need to endorse everything that Israel does. So, I mean, that's kind of my reaction. I think it's truly heartbreaking what civilians have to face in a situation of war. If you look back at World War II, a lot of German civilians suffered unjustly, or Japanese civilians. But once again, we cannot lose the bigger perspective. Did anyone speak out against the Hamas massacres? Once again, we have 75 or more % of Palestinians who supported Hamas celebrated in the streets. And so it's difficult to generalize. In a certain sense, it's not fair to generalize because there are truly innocent people who want to have nothing to do with this. And that is the terrible reality of war. So we can only wish and pray that Hamas surrenders as soon as possible for this war to end and this suffering to come to an end.
I have a few more questions, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience for a few questions of theirs. But I did want to grab this one before it sneaks away. Powerhouse says most of the people killed at the rave, talking about on October 7th, were gunned down by Israeli attack helicopters, as admitted to by the pilots themselves. So he's pushing back on the claim of October 7th and saying that, actually it was Israel who was killing most of these civilians, and they just admitted it. What would you say to stuff like that?
That's just completely absurd. I mean, I find that hard to take seriously. I think that's at the rank of blood libels in the Middle Ages, of complete conspiracy theories of why would the Israeli government do that to their own people. I mean, it's completely callous and honestly unbelievable. I have to say it's the first I hear of this, so I don't know if it's worth it, but I may look into it, where they get this idea.
There's a lot of people on social media saying it, but people can say anything. Actually backing it up with evidence is a very different discussion. Now, there have been a few instances that I've documented here on the channel where it appears that Catholic women were killed. 2 Catholic women were killed in a Catholic church. And we even see a few other instances where civilians have been killed. I think of aid worker trucks and things like that. Can you maybe comment on that? Because people will point to that and say, see, Israel is targeting civilians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, of course, it's a tragedy for any kind of civilian casualty. And there's no doubt that there are some Christians have been killed as well. And are there any hotheads in the IDF who lack discipline? I wouldn't be surprised at all that there are some. I'm pretty sure there are some. Once again, Israelis are very angry at what happened to them. Does it justify it? No, and no means. And it truly is heartbreaking, especially for the Christians, once again, who really are caught in the crossfire, and there's not a whole lot that they can do. So I'm not sure what more I can say about this. It's truly sad. And if there are those in the IDF who have, intentionally targeted civilians, you would hope they would be brought to justice.
Yeah, certainly. And do you think, however, that examples like that and just others in the situation going on right now in Gaza is going to create a bad blood for generations to come? Do you think that there really is going to be peace after this situation? It seems to me like many of the people in Gaza are going to be so angry and upset as to what's going on there that this will ensure that there are hostilities for generations to come.
I think it's possible. Is there going to be bad blood? For sure. But I would say the bad blood was already there. It's been there for decades already. And once again, there was a ceasefire on October 6th. So that's the tragedy of any war, that it leaves deep scars and wounds that are going to last for a while. It was already bad before the war started. So I don't know if that can be a pretext to say we need to stop the war because it's going to create bad blood. Once again, it's been 20 years that Israelis have been enduring rocket attacks and terror attacks, coming not just from the Palestinians, but from their allied jihadists across the Middle East. So so that's once again to the tragedy of the situation of the conflict. Yes, there is bad blood, but when you're dealing with an enemy who is vowed to your annihilation, you can't just stop and say, let's not do anything because it's going to create bad blood,
Yeah, I hear that. And by the way, everybody, go ahead and put your questions in the chat to @reason&theology, and we'll grab just a few. I have another question for you while we're waiting on that. So the subject of aid for the Palestinians, we hear reports that, Israel is just not sufficiently supplying aid to the Palestinians, and that even in some cases it's claimed that they're blocking aid. What would you say in response to that? Because people are trying to use that as a, pretext to say, well, there you go. They're trying to commit acts of genocide.
Right. I have to confess myself. I have to confess my own ignorance. I do not know the details. I have heard those claims, and I cannot deny or verify them as true or false. So once again, it goes back to the idea: if you're at a war, if you're in a state of war against your enemy, what is your responsibility to provide supplies to them? I think there is a certain humanitarian responsibility, but yeah, I mean, I guess I can't really respond to the specifics of what is actually going on.
Mahova asks, is peace even possible if Islam teaches that there won't be the final judgment until all Jews are destroyed or converted to Islam?
Very difficult question. I tend to be a little bit pessimistic about that question because I've talked to many people in Israel, Muslims and Jews. For sure, there are many Muslims who want peace, and we have certain Muslim countries that are moderate or have even become more moderate. Even the big surprise in the past decade is actually Saudi Arabia, which used to be considered as one of the most extreme ideologies or ideological nations, and now it is probably a bit of a power play kind of in reaction to Iran, but Saudi Arabia has actually become much more friendly to Israel. And also under Trump, we have the Middle Eastern, the Abraham Accords. And so certain countries like the Emirates and others that have actually come closer to Israel. So the Islamic countries are not a monolith, and we have many who understand, well, it doesn't pay off to sacrifice our quality of life and peace in the Middle East for an ideology, for an intolerant ideology. So how optimistic can we be? I really don't know. I'm not a prophet, and I do understand that the jihadist ideology is really a problem, but not all Muslims subscribe to it. So we can only hope that there would be greater work of education among Muslims in Muslim countries that would seek coexistence more than this perpetual jihad.
Pablo asks, why doesn't Israel use a fortress approach? Why do they need to occupy Palestine?
Why do they need to occupy Palestine? Well, let's remember that they did not occupy Gaza up until the war that the Palestinians started. So Gaza was not occupied. It was entirely given over to the Palestinians. In terms of the West Bank, well, it's a similar issue that there's been a willingness to create even a Palestinian state, but we have seen the Palestinians always resort to violence and incitement. So I'm not sure if the question just means just completely separate from them and just don't occupy them. That's easier said than done because the two are so intertwined. And we know that Israel's security depends also on controlling the Jordan Valley. So they have to control their own international borders along the Jordan Valley. And yeah, I guess that would be the main one, kind of separating the West Bank from Jordan. So it's not easily done. And also the West Bank, if you would give the entire West Bank to the Palestinians, you would have a very small, narrow corridor of Israel, kind of just a little bit north of Tel Aviv. I think it's something like 13 miles or something like that of Israel between the Mediterranean and the Palestinian territories. So unfortunately, if you would see goodwill on the part of the Palestinians to live side by side and coexist, I think it may be possible. But once again, if you see this culture of incitement on the Palestinian side, why would you give them the land? Why would you completely surrender the West Bank to the Palestinians? What have they learned from Gaza? They tried doing it with Gaza, and you saw Hamas basically rise up out of the autonomy that they gave to Gaza. So if Israel has learned one lesson, it has not worked at all with Gaza. Why should we take that risk with the West Bank now?
I want to ask a follow-up question, something I heard from Finkelstein. Of course, he's kind of your Palestinian or pro-Palestinian speaker online. And somebody asked me earlier in the chat, why don't I invite him on? I have invited him on multiple times. I haven't heard a response. Oddly enough, I've invited on pretty much all of the top players in the discussion, but I haven't received any responses in most cases, and in one case, one of them did respond but declined. Another difficulty is it's actually incredibly hard to find a pro-Palestinian speaker who is not in favor of terrorism. They're out there. Don't get me wrong, they are out there, and I've reached out to them and invited them, but actually some of them are in favor of terrorism, and so I'm not really interested in having them on. I don't know if that says something about the nature of the group that they're defending, or if it just means that they have really poor people defending their position. But yeah, that's kind of the difficulty there. It's really hard to find somebody who can speak from their perspective. But anyways, all right. So in reference to Finkelstein, he said that in concerning the West Bank, with West Bank settlers that we see right now in that territory, he says that according to international law, that's illegal. Care to comment on that?
Yeah, well, I find that interesting. That is there a connection between the Jewish people and the West Bank, which are known, of course, as Judea and Samaria? We know that, ironically, when I teach the prophets and I teach the Old Testament, you notice the settlement of the land of Canaan in the book of Joshua, and the first areas that the Israelites conquered were actually the areas on the West Bank. So we're talking about, what is today Nablus or Shechem and Hebron and Bethlehem and all those areas. It's almost like the inverted map of today. Today it's the Palestinian territories, but back then they were the first lands that Israel conquered. So we're talking a connection with the land that goes as far back as 1200 BC or so, or even perhaps later than that. When we talk about the modern geopolitical situation, I find it interesting. How can it be that over 1 million Arabs can live in Israel with full human rights? They serve at all levels of society. We have Arabs on the Supreme Court. We have Arabs in the Knesset. We have Arabs in the army, in the Israeli police, at every level of society. We have Arab professors in universities. So why is it not a problem for over 1 million Arabs to live in the Jewish state with full rights as citizens? But it's a huge problem and a violation of international law for a few tens of thousands of Jews to live in Palestinian areas in their own community, which by and large were purchased. Originally, they were very, very often empty hills. So I don't quite understand myself the double standard here. Why is it okay for so many Arabs to live in the Israeli areas, but Jews are considered an obstacle to peace if they live anywhere in the West Bank? So who is really trying to do some ethnic cleansing here?
It's a fair response, and I certainly appreciate that. And wrapping it up here, I want to give you an opportunity to perhaps throw in anything else that you wanted to address that we didn't get a chance to cover. So anything else that you want to touch on?
Sure. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate the opportunity. I would say maybe just to connect that with our last conversation, which was much more theological and today tends to be a lot more political. And I know that probably most of your listeners and viewers are Catholics. Mm-hmm. And so last time we talked more about the biblical roots of Israel, and today we talked about what is less my area of expertise. And I would really encourage Catholics to inform yourself and to reflect on the connection between the biblical Israel and the people of Israel to whom God has made promises. And promises, if we're going to believe that God is faithful, then so many Catholics have a type of great disconnect mentality. On the one hand, you have Israel in the Bible, and then Christ comes, and now the church is a new Israel, so Israel has no more place in God's plan. And now we're dealing with this conflict in the Middle East with a people that just happens to call itself Israel. And I would encourage Catholics to, and all Christians, really all people, to reflect on this connection. And maybe you can refer, you said you'd post our previous conversation and link it to this video, that the Lord promises he will return his people back to the land. And in fact, the people of Israel will experience extraordinary hostility, as we read in the prophets, on the part of their enemies. The prophet Zechariah speaks that all nations will rise up against Jerusalem, and Jerusalem will become a stumbling stone against all nations. And that's going to be the instrument by which God will deliver and save his people. So we're seeing a lot of things happen in our own day and age that I really do believe there are profound theological connections. And many say that ultimately this is not a political conflict. It's ultimately a religious conflict. Does Israel do everything perfectly? Not by any means. There is plenty that you can criticize about Israel, and most Israelis are engaged in full-time criticism of their own government and their own state. But as Catholics and Christians, I do believe we have a responsibility to love the people of Israel. And like anyone that you love, sometimes it involves also saying hard truths. But please don't be swept by all the propaganda that is out there, by the justification of terrorism or even ignorance of everything that Israel has faced in the last 100 years and tried to establish themselves, rising up from the ashes of the Holocaust and finding themselves a place among the nations, but still encountering hostility from not just their neighbors, but from increasingly from the whole world, including a West that has completely lost its bearings. And it's also by no coincidence that we find all these radical leftist groups that are profoundly leaning towards anarchy and the dismantlement of their own societies in the West. What do they have to do with Israel? I mean, what's the connection? There's no logical connection at all. If they were so concerned about justice, where were they when Syria was killing hundreds of thousands of their own people, and the genocide in Sudan? Or when are they ever rising up against the oppression of women in Iran, right? So there's
what do you think is behind that?
What's that?
What do you think's behind that? Why do you think they've taken an interest in that?
Well, because it's a spiritual war, because we're dealing with essentially the spirit of Antichrist, that we're seeing. The more we see people turn away from God, we're going to see a hatred of the church. We're going to see a hatred of Christian values and biblical values. And apparently, completely irrationally, you're going to see this rise of a hatred against Israel, which seems to make no sense. What do BLM supporters and advocates have to do with Israel? Just think of the oxymoron of the queers for Palestine, right? It may be queers for Palestine, but they're not going to last long as queers in Palestine. They're going to be thrown off roofs. So what do they have to do with the whole situation, with the conflict? We're seeing the rise of the spirit of Antichrist, which manifests itself as a great hatred of everything that has to do with God, including Christian ethics, Catholic teachings on life, and also God's chosen people, the people of Israel.
And I highly recommend y'all go and watch that video with the professor and I, where we go into this in more detail, because people are going to say, but wait, the church is the new Israel. And, it's actually a both and in many ways here. And so let's go and watch that before you comment on that situation, because I know there's some people itching to comment on it. If you haven't seen that video, you can't comment on it. Here's something from Mahoville. Is this question even relevant? Israel is sovereign and intentionally recognition. I don't know what that is.
Recognized, maybe.
I don't know. If you go back long enough, everyone stole land from someone else. And by the way, thank you for the soup chat. Okay, what do you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. Just like in anything in Europe, every land in Europe, you've seen the borders changed, and you don't see Germans today clamoring to get back Eastern Prussia from Poland. So you've had movements of population. Every war, you're going to see loss of territory. And in some ways, you're right. You're constantly seeing one people being occupied by another. And as we started this conversation, if you just go back long enough, you're going to find who's going to be in the land of Israel. Well, the Israelites. Before that were the Canaanites, but there were no such thing as the Palestinian people. So I think really a good step in the right direction would be basically to get over it on the part of the Palestinians. The question of the refugees cannot be, you can't just hang on to it for decades just by saying you've occupied the land of our forefathers. The Palestinians are the ones who back then, they were not even calling themselves the Palestinians, but they're the ones who launched this war against Israel in 1948 and refused to accept the very existence of the state of Israel. So at a certain point, you have to take responsibility for your own actions and understand that there has been a shift in territory. Jewish refugees are also not clamoring to go back to Algeria and Egypt and Lebanon. They moved to Israel, and that's where they settled. So it would probably be the best for the Palestinian refugees to do the same.
Shell Bo says, insert outrageous, infuriating question here. I love that. That's
good.
Yeah, a very, very helpful contribution. There was one other question that I saw way earlier, and it was something to the effect of, what do European Jews have to do with the land of Israel? Why do they get to come in and take that land? It was something to that effect. Care to comment?
Well, if you go back to the ancestry of European Jews, if they're Jews, you're probably going to find them go back to at some point to Israel. So look, if we look at the map of the Middle East, there's the question. So if you look at the map of the Middle East, you see this tiny, tiny strip of land, which is the land of Israel. And once again, we cannot forget the perspective and the history of this people who have been wandering for centuries and millennia, have experienced all forms of anti-Semitism and expulsion from their lands. We often forget that the Jews were kicked out of most Christian nations throughout the Middle Ages. And so this stereotype of the wandering Jew is not entirely a stereotype. This is something that was forced upon them. And so they have their own state. They're struggling to find the balance between being a democratic state open to all, but at the same time, it is a Jewish state. And I can say out of my own personal experience, I lived there as a Catholic, and I understood in a certain way I did not exactly belong because I was not Jewish. I knew I could not immigrate, and so I kind of understood this. On the other hand, I met a lot of people, made a lot of friends, and I respected, here I am, the guest in the land of Israel, and with trying to have an understanding of this history that they have gone through a lot in the last 2,000, even 3,000 years. And I think it's our responsibility, especially as Christians, to understand what they've been through. Again, it doesn't mean a blank check. Everything that Israel does is not necessarily justified, but I think it calls for a certain sympathy together with the biblical connection of the land of Israel to the people of Israel, something that's part of our own heritage. And I think it's something we should appreciate, not to mention the very Messiah that we have received from the people of Israel. So in a certain sense, we should be grateful to the Jewish people and the people of Israel.
Well, Professor Villeneuve, I really appreciate you coming on and doing this. This was incredibly helpful. I want to get you back on the show if you're willing to come back, and let's talk about the Old Testament and some of the contributions you've done there with various commentaries on it and all that good stuff. I think that would be a great theological discussion. So
I'd be glad to be back anytime.
Yeah, looking forward to that. Everybody hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. By the way, do you have a plug that you want to put in? Any direct?
Sure, yeah. Visit CatholicsForIsrael.com. We engage in a lot of those questions. There was a lot of articles and videos. I'm also working on a whole catechesis project, a whole online Bible course, survey of salvation history. The materials have been there for a decade, but now I'm actually recording videos and teachings that can be used in your parish or in your own Bible study. So there's a lot of stuff there, including a lot of the questions that we discussed today. So CatholicsForIsrael.com.
Is it on YouTube also, these videos?
It's also on YouTube, yeah.
What's the name of the YouTube channel?
Good question. I think it's handled Catholics for Israel.
I'll see if I can find it. I imagine it's on the website, right?
Yes, it is. There's a link on the website. Yeah.
Awesome. That's exciting. Well, again, looking forward to it. Everybody hit the like button and the subscribe button. God bless.